Hello, greetings from Washington, D.C. and from around the world. We're here to talk today about increasing resilience by assuring trust in medicine, credentials, and supply chains. My name is Dr. David Bray. I'm here as your host from the Atlantic Council Geotech Center for a fascinating panel of experts that bring together diverse perspectives on this topic. We're excited to be partnering with SICPA on this conversation, and I want to turn first to Philippe Gillet from SICPA to sort of set the scene for us. And Philippe, why is trust so essential to medicine, credentials, and supply chains?
Thank you, David. Welcome to everybody on this, I would hope, lively discussion. So, of course, trust is essential in all health-related matters for a very simple reason. Everybody will understand health is a primary value for people. We also know that it has a cost to society, but that cost must be considered as an investment that must be controlled with all the numerous trade-offs and arguable KPIs we usually present. So yes, we have to fight for trust to be built by design in the world of healthcare. So designing and building systems that stand the test of time while delivering the greatest outcomes for patients means maintaining trust with healthcare patients. So the COVID-19 crisis has shown the need to strengthen the link between physical reality and this digital counterpart, the data in the healthcare systems. If I look to medicine and trust, in the past months, we have all seen how having the right medicine for the right pathology is key. We have also seen an increase of counterfeited tests and antiviral drugs on the market, as well as fake masks or makeshift ventilators. So these highlights real weaknesses in the control of the medical supply chain and a need for an end-to-end traceability because saving lives is really at stake. So this crisis also revealed the criticality of health-related data. This is today what we could name the intangible part of trust. We have seen that data protection and privacy is a sensitive subject with the introduction, for instance, in Europe of tracking applications, just as an example. We want to prevent misuse of such applications and data theft. This is one of the first life-size experiments on the subject, and I think lessons will have to be learned from that experience, large-scale experience. And perhaps because I'm a faculty, I'm very close to science and to universities. In the end, science and medical research was not spared. I'm talking about to the recent scandal of the Lancet, one of the most renowned scientific journal in medicine. A big data analysis, type analysis, was found to have been largely manipulating data. For me, this is extremely serious because for me, medical data and science data are the basis for public health decisions. And trust needs to be reinforced too in this part of the health system, which relies a lot on published scientific evidence. So for me, this last point, which has just appeared in the last few weeks, is something that we also need to consider with great interest. That's it for perhaps saying that trust is badly needed in today, but also in the near and long future of the health systems.
Thank you, Philippe. And I really like how you set the scene, recognizing there are at least three different dimensions to thinking about trust when it comes to medicine, credentials, and supply chains. I like how you identified that it's both, can you actually have trust in that product or that service or that good? So the tangibility side. And then you talked about the intangibility about, can we have trust in the data? And then, like you said, the most recent events that have happened where it looks like, unfortunately, the data itself was manipulated and the interpretations that came from that. So it's also then the sense making or the publications associated with interpreting the data that might be about something medical related as well. Needs to have solid grounding as well. So I think that sets the stage next to turn to our additional panelists. I want to turn first to Yves and ask Yves, first, if you can introduce yourself real quick, and then two, how have you developed trust in supply chains and in your different roles and in medicine? What has helped you in those circumstances?
Yes, good evening, everybody, or good morning. I'm the CEO of the International Committee of the Red Cross. I just stepped down right now a few days ago from my job, and I will now soon move to Harvard to teach and learn there. Maybe the interesting things, when I look at my own work, I think I've heard Philip talking about data, I've heard Philip talking about tools, I've heard Philip talking about, also process, but in my world, people are also central. In my world, when you have to discuss with government, but also armed groups in order to convince them that they should not block your medicines at the custom, I can tell you, you can make as many Zoom you want, as many data you want, you still need to sit with the people. It's amazing. I would say over the last coming month or last months again, the people element was a critical element. And I would say if there is one thing I want to stress is invest in people. Again, we've seen that. Invest in people. And we've seen that with all the pandemic over the last years. In Ebola is a good example. SARS, again now, invest in people in frontline. They are absolutely central, and we know it. But we also know how much communities are important. Invest in the communities. They need to understand what's happening. And again, I found that super interesting to observe that it's much more difficult for any solutions when it comes to pandemic if people do not trust the community, if they don't trust the leadership, they don't trust the government. I would argue you can make almost a direct link between the level of trust, and that can be measures in country, and the performance when it comes to COVID-19. So I would say people who have trusted more their mayor, their local authorities, or the government are behaving much more interestingly than any other thing. So investing in people is the first element. And maybe my second point would be my world is don't, let's say, be clear and recognize the context in which you operate. This is super important. And it could be a context of course, a specific pandemic or specific issues. And here, just good opportunity for me to say, we're not living in a world, I'm hearing that too much, where people are saying, can we talk about after COVID-19 world? We are in a world absolutely deeply into COVID-19. Right. And we will live with that for quite a long time. So I think, again, this discussion is about trust and how do we navigate that, how do we increase resilience during the crisis is super important.
Excellent. And I love how you pointed and you emphasize it's got to be about the people, and it's got to be people in the context that they're operating at the local level or the situation they're in. And like you said, those who think that COVID is over, probably not the case. And like you said, we'll be with this for a long time. So that's a great segue now to Divya. Divya, can you give a little bit about your background and how have you developed trust in medicine as well in your different roles?
Yeah, so I also straddle worlds. I'm both a practicing anesthesiologist and critical care physician, but I also am a data scientist, and I use data in order to make life-saving decisions. So I think this has set up everything really nicely. So there's a couple of things I want to play off. This idea of trust in people. Well, as everyone recognizes, COVID has actually shown how our supply chain and trust systems have broken down. And as you can see in the United States, but also say for migrant populations, generally vulnerable populations, many of them don't have accesses to resources within the supply chain. And when it gets to the point, as they were talking about in New York City, where we're going to have to start rationing supplies, medical supplies, things that would save your life, often the first to go in that equation are those that have already been marginalized, whether through violence or socioeconomic conditions. So that's a particular kind of trust. And I would, as the world can see, based on what's happening in the United States, that system of trust has not yet been reestablished. So that's speaking to the trust amongst people. The people side of it also goes to data. As was mentioned earlier by Philippe, if people don't trust where their data is going, it's almost the most precious data that you have, your own biometric data. If they don't trust where it's going, they're not going to want to give it up, whether it's for their own sake or for the sake of public health. So securing systems in which you can convince people that that transaction is something that will be valued, that will be deeply honored, that it's sacred, and that you will re-empower that transaction is of the utmost importance. And then the piece of it that is on data, for instance, that people myself use as scientists. Uh, well, again, we often put trust in trusted sources. Now, when our sources fall down, as again was mentioned with the Lancet, right? What do you do then? Because it becomes very difficult to vet everything at every point in the process. We depend on journals like the Lancet, the Journal of the American Medical Association, et cetera, to give us reasonably well informed data because we assume it's been peer reviewed. We assume that somebody has checked and verified the sources and streams of data for bias. We assume that it's been labeled well, denoised, that all of these things can be trusted. And right now, it seems, especially as when there is fraud in science and medicine, there is a decoupling of the correct incentives. And whether it's following money or it's the desire to be famous or the desire to say that we have that thing, that drug, that therapeutic, and we want to get that out there. Um, I think that this is a huge problem, and we have to learn how to incentivize things. Finally, I know we're going to talk a little bit on this call about supply chain, so I just want to introduce this idea. Our supply chain has been shown to be extraordinarily fragile, and we would have thought, for instance, in some of these developed countries, it would not have been so fragile. But one of the things we've done is outsource most of our supply chain for the sake of efficiency. And there's no redundancy in this system. And nobody seemed to understand what their own baseline capacities were. So they never anticipated during a pandemic what kind of surge capacity they would need. So I think we need to start looking at more local supply chain, but also having capacity that we can immediately ramp up, whether it's building capital equipment or providing protective equipment.
Excellent, and I know that's going to warm Philippe's heart because that's near and dear to his thoughts about the economy of trust, which we will definitely be touching on in this conversation. I also like your point about recognizing that we need to make sure everyone has both data dignity, but also can be assured that treatments are done equitably and that there is not discrimination in that space. So thank you, Divya. Now we'll turn to Idris and talk about. Can you talk a little bit about your role and what you've done in terms of where have you seen developing trust in medicine and supply chains as well?
Yes, hi, thank you. So I'm Idris Jesus. I'm the head of primary care division at the Geneva University Hospital and University of Medicine. So basically, we give access to care to all residents of the state of Geneva. And obviously, as a physician, I hope that the trust between the patient and me, between the patient and the fellows, are based on our training, the way we share decision, communicate information. But in fact, and I guess I relate perfectly with Yves D'accord, we also benefit for a global trust. Swiss physicians are one of the most trusted physicians. It might be because of the way we have been trained, but it's mostly because Switzerland overall is a trusted place. That's why Yves D'accord was probably in Geneva during the last 10 years and many other institutions. So I guess I don't believe you can have trust in medicine without having trust in your cops, without having trust in the way tax money is used, the way you can access to food. So I really think it's a package, and Switzerland is a good example of this package of trust. I also think that trust is basically facilitated when you know the people. And knowing the people in Switzerland, I don't think you can do much more than asking them to vote on a monthly basis on so many questions. And this builds trust, because whatever the decision is taken, whether it was your decision or not, Swiss citizens can believe and trust in the system because the decision is based on the majority, I would say, and at least your opinion has been accounted for. my last suggestion is inequalities. I guess trust for some, but not others, is feasible in some or many countries. What you aim is trust for all, and that all trust the system. And Switzerland is characterized by a very low socio-economic inequality. And for me, that's really key, so that every single resident can believe, can think, can be convinced that he is counted as the other residents. And for me, that's even more the reason for trust in medicine than all the hours we try to provide the best care in our daily practice.
Excellent, and I like how you sort of is how you also framed that it's thinking about, as we heard from Yves, it's about thinking about people, they matter, but as you also pointed out, the whole society, that it comes as a whole package. You can't just do trust in medicine if the society itself hasn't figured out a way to address it. And then emphasizing also what was also said by Divya, it's also thinking about trust in equality and that people will be treated equitably and there will not be discrimination. So that outlines some very key principles also when we think about the economy of trust. I'm now going to pivot to Danielle. And Danielle, if you could talk a little bit about your role and actually share what have you seen in terms of developing trust in supply chains and what works in terms of what have you seen?
Sure. Thank you so much, David. Hi, everyone. I'm Danielle Torino. I'm co-founder of Codex. We're a data security and privacy company, and I am also the president of Young People in Recovery, where we bring substance use disorder treatment and recovery to young people across the United States. And so, yes, to what everybody has said so far, specifically around that idea of person-centered security, that our perspective is that when we build a system that is secure by design and can touch on all of those different elements that have to do with how we're securing data, to data provenance, to how that data is used effectively in making healthcare decisions and even clinical decision support. And then also, right now specifically, we have 3 public health crises going on in the United States, as I see it. We have the COVID-19 pandemic. We have an ongoing addiction and behavioral health public health crisis, and we have a health and equity public health crisis. And all of that swirls and revolves around this idea that the public health system actually cannot be trusted by the people, which means specifically now as we're trying to come up with new and innovative ways to bring telehealth services to doctor deserts across the country. But if you don't want to share with me personally inside an office what is going on with you out of fear of those things, you are definitely not going to want to share those personal elements of your healthcare with me over a computer screen. And so how do we come up with better policies and systems that are designed, that security by design being sort of the basis for what we do. And then all the way down to client trust and supply chain trust. If I can't trust that, I'm not going to tell you things about me. And we often see, I worked for the government for a long time in sort of innovative health information technology systems approaches. We had issues with training, and we had issues with people not wanting to participate because they were so deeply scared that their information wouldn't be protected, or that information that was recorded incorrectly that led to medical error was going to continue to follow them throughout their healthcare experience.
So I love what you were talking about in terms of the landscape, and in particular, pointing out that if people don't have trust already in person, doing things when we try to address doctor deserts, as you mentioned, through telemedicine, that's going to even be harder to develop trust remotely. And so that needs to be remedied. And like you said as well, though, it's also people thinking about if they engage in something that's digital or data or through telemedicine, what is going to be done with the resulting data as a result, and sort of what's the stewardship associated with that. So thank you, Danielle, for that. And I'm now going to turn to Peter and actually ask the same question. If you could real quick introduce yourself, and what have you seen about developing trust in supply chains as well?
Thanks, David. Peter Rashish, I direct a program on geoeconomics at AICGS, which is a think tank focusing on the US and Germany at Johns Hopkins University. And I look at these issues through the lens of trade and the global economy And I agree with what Divya said, that there's been a tendency, if you look at how globalization has been structured, to think about efficiency and less about resilience, what sometimes is contrasted as the just-in-time versus the just-in-case economy. But I do think there's more than one way of thinking about resilience and building trust that way. And I do sort of see two emerging schools. And I think it's important to think about those two options carefully. And I think on the one hand, I see a more static kind of sense of what resilience means. And then on the other hand, I see a more dynamic one. And just to give you a couple of examples, if you take a static view of resilience in building trust, that you say to yourself, okay, I look around the world, I see that if I'm a country or a business, my supply chains have become very vulnerable because of this public health crisis. So let me pull everything home. I'll be able to assert control because I, as a government or as a company, am concerting control. That will engender trust among voters, consumers, whoever your constituency may be. I think a more dynamic view would say there's really no such thing as control, because while the crisis may come from China this time, it might come from the United States or someplace in Europe the next time. And so only thing you can do is try to set yourself up to be able to manage that uncertainty. And so in that sense, what you want is you want to push diversification, adaptability, options, flexibility, and that's the way to go. And instead of just trying to sort of solve the problem by asserting control. The other example I would say is that, okay, let's say you're a government and you've seen all this incredible hit the economy's taken, right? So you've got joblessness and economic growth is declining, and you say, okay, again, I want to fix that problem now. I'm gonna bring home the supply chains, bring home production. We're gonna make things here. We're gonna create American jobs, and that's gonna create trust in people. A dynamic view, I think, would say that there's a risk in relying only on US firms, because when you do that, you close off those US firms to healthy competition from foreign firms, which keeps them sharp. And so over time, these US firms, the quality of their products starts to go down, they probably become more expensive, and over time, you're actually gonna find the consumers are losing trust, not only in firms, but maybe over time, even in the whole economic system or in the political leadership. And so if that's in that case, what you really want to do is maintain as many kinds of trade and investment relationships as possible. And through that diversification, you really can ensure resilience and thus trust.
Excellent, and I think you're hitting it on the head that those who might go to isolationism may discover very unintended effects that actually undermine trust and undermine overall economic performance as a result. So thank you for that, Peter. Philippe, I know you probably are chomping a bit, because a lot of what the panelists have said so far touches upon the idea of the economy of trust. And so could you talk a little bit more about what SICPA has been doing in this space to increase the resilience via the economy of trust approach, and maybe sort of outline for the audience what you see as the core parts of the economy of trust?
Perhaps starting, it's very difficult to define what the economy of trust is, because it's just putting two words together, economy and trust. But let's say that the economy of trust is perhaps a way to say that it's a way to contribute to the, I would say, economic, social, and environmental sustainability by building trust by design, I would say, as it was already mentioned several times, in every physical or digital transaction or interaction and product in daily life, and doing that by leveraging the power of transparency and technology. So it's some sort of association of different approaches, but I think this is what we, I think, need or use as a definition of the economy of trust. It's not really something new. Okay, it's something that is I think a very old way of thinking, but I think it's urgent to rethink at least the economy of trust. So what I was noting during the discussion here at this stage is that it appears that we have two worlds that have been created. So one, which is the real one, the actual world, the people. Several panelists mentioned the people as central. That's of course central, but we let the creation. So there is the creation of a new world, which is this digital world, and it's looks like we have two worlds that are interacting or not interacting. And I think we need to just say we have one world. The digital is not a digital world. It's just something that is in the actual world. And we need to bring these two concepts into a unique one, which is, I would say, humankind and the actual world. So for SIGPA, this is what we're trying to do. So we are trying to help trust by providing things that permits authentication, traceability of goods, and 10 years ago it was mostly a physical way to look at the problem. Now we have the data, and the data is just an avatar of the actual world, and so it's very important to make the two things linked. And today we're looking to the way that, as it was already mentioned, looking at the way we can be sure that the data are related to a real object or a real person, and that when you're tackling the data, you need to ensure that the data, you can prove their provenance, you can prove their authenticity, their integrity, and that the data have been produced in a fair way, for instance, or are related to something that is real and not fake. And this is the way we approach the problem. It's true for medicine, but it's also true for food. It's true for everything we are dealing with in the actual world. So this is the way, I would say, our philosophical approach is to try to do our best for having trust by design in every transaction, in every way we do economy among people.
Excellent. And thank you, Philippe. And I would say for those of you who are watching on social media, if you have questions, please use the hashtag GoodTechChoices, and we will dive into those questions in a few moments. And I want to sort of build on what you were talking about, Philippe. You were talking about how these worlds that we may have thought about, that there's the world of people and the world of physical things and the world of digital, that really there's really just all the same world. And as you said, the economy of trust is knowing for certain that something that's in digital form actually has a physical asset that is tied to it. So maybe, Danielle, you talked about people-centered approaches. Sort of where are sort of your thoughts about what's necessary to have the confidence that when you have a data element that's representing something that's in the physical world, that you can have confidence in the lineage and in the actual reality of that actual asset?
Absolutely. That's a great question too. Thank you. So I think it comes down to something that was just said around this idea of security by design, right? The more that our patients and our people see the vulnerabilities associated with online data sharing, the less likely they might be to trust that the data that they are sharing is in fact protected, right? And so that piece about authenticity in sharing data and how we are verifying credentials through a system, whether it be through blockchain technology or the other ledger systems that exist in the industry, that first and foremost, I trust that I'm actually talking to the person that I am talking to, and that the data being entered was entered by someone with those credentials. And then all the way up to the supply chain, can I trust that the actual physical things I am receiving are what they say that they are? And then I think a lot of it is also about that idea of privacy and reinforcing that these tools are designed with privacy and security in mind. Unfortunately, I've seen a lot of movement in the United States to say that in order to come into technical compliance, we're going to tamper down on privacy and security regulation, and we're going to allow things to slip through the cracks because we believe that we cannot technically design around those regulations. And in my experience, that's really not the case. That there are innovative industry leaders all around the world who can design to those compliances and design to that idea that the government and the systems also has an obligation to protect your privacy and security.
Excellent, and thank you, Danielle. And
sorry, David, may I just add something to this very specific?
Sure, go ahead, Philippe, and then go ahead. Sure.
I think for instance, in the last months we have worked on immunity passports or health passports, and in the end, we decided to do it in another way. It's not just a technological approach. And coming back to what Yves and others said, is just to say, okay, we are dealing with people. So for us, it was extremely important. It's still important to see what is the acceptance or the acceptability in the end by the people. So what are they? So we need to explain, and we need to see where the people want to go. You cannot impose things. You need to make them acceptable by the people. And this is something that we, as I would say, as industrials, we need to learn, because I think it's important to not impose things, is to make them acceptable.
Excellent, and thank you, Philippe. And I'd like to now go to Tumas. And Tumas, you've obviously had to grapple with these issues as president of Estonia in terms of trust and digital identity. Might you have some insights that you might be able to share with us as well here? Oh, we may need to unmute you.
Yeah, I'd separate issue of trust in supply chains from trust in medicine and medical records. I also chaired the European Commission Task Force on e-health. And I'd say that I'll leave aside the supply chain side, because that's something that Philippe can talk about a while. But we have actually our system here in Estonia, which we rolled out in 2001, has medical records that you decide. Well, basically, it comes to the fact that you own your own data. You decide which doctor will be able to see your medical records. We have built-in mutual reciprocal transparency, so I can see who accesses whatever I own. But certainly in the case of medical records, only the doctor that I have authorized to see my records can see it. And it is, and since 2007, all medical records, and with other data as well, but all medical records have been essentially on blockchain, on a keyless signature, so that in terms of data integrity for medical records, where it's in very good shape. And I would say on the privacy argument, or the privacy issue, I feel far more secure about my system than any other. And I would say, if you look at what happened to Michael Schumacher when he had his terrible accident about 8 years ago, he, within hours, all of his medical records were in Bild-Zeitung, or the largest yellow newspaper in Europe, right? Because it's on paper, and you don't know who went in there and took it and made a photocopy. Whereas since all transactions are logged, that could not happen, or you would immediately know who might have done it. It certainly cuts down on the risk of that information being shared. So on medical records and trust, it's very high in this country, and has been for quite a while. Now, on the other issue here, again, we had some pretty bad supply issues here and on quality and so forth. And I think I think at the national level, you can deal with the data privacy and integrity level with the right technology, I should say. All communication with your records are done through end-to-end encryption and two-factor authentication, and all of that good stuff is there and has been. Once you go out of the nation state and you start looking at companies abroad, I think we need to develop some kind of regime that would guarantee a political regime. This is not, with technological solutions, obviously, but a political regime such as COCOM or Wassenaar was during for all kinds of whatever. For forbidden goods to go to bad places, and similarly, I guess with the blood diamonds, you also there as well need to have an international regime that would enable us to feel secure about the quality of or the security of the supply chain. So I would basically say that, but it is not impossible to have trust in your medical records. And the reason you don't have it in the United States, where I just came back from 3.5 years of being at Stanford, is that, I mean, as long as the United States won't have, if you don't have a secure identity system, if you don't have two-factor authentication, you still do everything through an email address and a single force breakable password, you're not going to have security. And so, this is not even health. This is just, if you do not have a secure system, forget about trust. All things are possible. So, that's a really deep political decision to be made by countries. We made it, others don't. Anyway, that's all.
Very helpful. Thank you, Tomas. And I think you're absolutely right that you have to make a commitment to doing digital hygiene as a fundamental first before you try to do anything else on top of it. And so I appreciate you sharing your insights there. Peter, I want to pivot to you, and as Philippe sort of said, and Danielle talked about, we're going from a world of where there's going to be, in 2 years or less, 75 billion or more network devices on the face of the planet relative to 7.7 billion human beings. So we'd have the opportunity, in theory, to have greater visibility real time into supply chains. But I guess I'd be interested in your thoughts both about that and what's your assessment of how many companies right now have good real time visibility into their supply chains to even begin with?
Well, I would pick up on what Thomas Ilves said about blockchain. I think not only for in the medical sphere, I think more broadly, that combined with the Internet of Things can mean that all sorts of things in the supply chain will be able to be traced much better than before. In a sort of, again, in a non-hierarchical way, you can really increase transparency that way. You can increase transparency not only about, whether there's a production stop in one point in the supply chain, so that means you have to shift to the backup that you've of course now established because you've learned from the crisis, or whether it means that there's been a violation of, there's a counterfeit, or there's been a labor or environmental standard violation. So I think that technology is going to be a big help in all sorts of pieces of the supply chain. I would just say that if there's one early lesson from what we've all been experiencing, both in our professional and personal lives, is how quickly I think a lot of us adapted to the virtual economy. So I think that we're going to be in this for a while, and I would not want to bet on things going back to normal 100%. And I do think that means that it's even more important for governments to play catch up and really start writing some rules for the digital economy, which basically don't exist. And so whether that's in a global level, which might be tough, or breaking that down between the US and the European Union or others, I think that's an area of priority now. It's something we've learned from this crisis.
Excellent, and well said that we may need to look at what are policy and geopolitical actions that we can do, because without those people and process steps, the technology, while useful, maybe will create challenges for us. I want to turn to Yves, because recognizing thank you for joining us, and I know you're going to have to leave at 10 minutes before the hour, so I want to get to you to have a chance to do some rejoinders before we press on. You've obviously had to deal with very dynamic environments with the International Red Cross, where it's cross borders, it's changing circumstances. Given everything you've heard so far, what would make your life easier when it comes to these dynamic medical environments that's not present today, or should be present and is not there?
It's a very good question. I would say I would build on what Peter said. We are definitely looking for a dynamic, resilient model, no questions. And I think if I'm just trying to, and we are integrating the learning of the last few months, one is we certainly, including at the International Red Cross, I do have to organize myself. So I have a global shared service around the world. We have to look for efficiency, and we certainly looked too much for efficiency. Surprisingly enough. So I would have to reconsider slightly how I would really build not just my supply chain, but almost my network. Because that was one, and B, the data question is super important. The blockchain is super important in order to allow us, for example, to do smart contracting and create confidence. But you know what? What we totally missed was, in fact, partnership. And interestingly, in a crisis like that, suddenly what you thought was a given, you start need to see your partner, in that case, let's be very clear, We were requesting in March to have, able to have planes going in every different places, including do the last mile. Suddenly, partner had no plane anymore, nothing. So it's interesting to reflect sometimes, and maybe one question for us is always being able to really look at the data questions, push it as much as you want, but at the same time be smart. And I think what we didn't do very well is to reflect certainly in terms of what was the epidemiological plan, what it means in disaster recovery, and coming back to almost basic. And in that case, partnership was something that we missed, certainly.
Excellent, and that goes back to your original point about empowering the people, and it's about not just your people, but the people that you may be second or third or removed from, and making sure that when things hit the fan, you have so that points even more to the question of the economy of trust as being not just your data, but other people's data on their readiness too. So thank you for that, Yves. Divya, given your experiences, I know you've been working on efforts to try and make sure, much like how Tomas was talking about, that people are aware when their data is accessed, and it's more about putting sort of agency back to people. Could you talk a little bit about that and how that might apply to a medical setting?
Yeah, so thanks, David. And again, I feel like there's a mild mind meld going on here. I'm in complete agreement with so many of the things that have been said. The first piece of it is that data trust we were talking about. So if I'm a public health official and I want to be able to act on this in a medical setting, at the moment, as a US citizen, I don't feel particularly comfortable contributing my data into that system because I have no idea how it's going to be used and how it's going to be secured or protected. Um, in fact, this sort of core problem, what ended up blowing up in our faces, not just in the US, but all over the world, is one of the reasons that I became part of a NASA task force that was convened in order to look at more distributed solutions. And we identified many of the pain points that are being talked about here. So, that first piece, everyone's individual data privacy, and how do you actually secure them at the edge and in this sort of distributed IoT? But it's not just an internet of things, it's an internet of people, it's an internet of animals, it's an internet of all kinds of connected systems. The second piece of it is, do we want a centralized system or a decentralized system? The third piece of it is, how do you bring in so many disparate data streams so that they become medically or public health actionable? And finally, where are the security layers? And so we've been trying to build, we actually started a startup to answer all these questions during this task force called Plexus. And this system is looking at one, initiating new kinds of protocols on all these different edge devices that both secure these edge devices, but enable people to now finally own their own data and actually consider what those transactions mean. The second piece of that is, you may have security at the edge and maybe somewhere at the center, but what happens in the middle of that transaction? And that can still be hacked on the internet. So we are wrapping the internet with security layers as well, so that they sit on top of the TCP/IP protocols. The third piece of it is, we are trying to standardize nomenclature so that when you bring in disparate data streams, whether it's contact tracing or passage sewage water monitoring, or taking into account where your supplies are. So, how many ventilators do we have? How many medical personnel are actually available per state, per county, per country? We have a way of labeling that data to bring it into the system. I mean, I also was at Stanford for 8 years, and believe it or not, I'd be in the perioperative area, and the way we would label your heart rate might be HR, and the guys next door to us were calling it heart rate. And then down the hall, it was called pulse. And we were all on the same EMR. And then we'd have to turn to the guys in bioinformatics and say, hey, can you write some NLP protocols for us to actually combine our data within the same system? If we have that problem within one hospital system, imagine the global scope of this problem. So, standardizing nomenclature and taxonomy, I think, is actually a very important piece of this. And if we only do it by names, imagine what happens when you change languages. So, there has to be a way to build this system correctly. And finally, I want to touch on the globalization piece of it. We've settled on a more decentralized network model. It's not blockchain, but we have settled on this. And the idea is that nodes, once they have been authenticated, should be able to send data that's been verified into the system without having to pass through hierarchical layers in order to enter. And the example there that we give is this time this virus sort of happened in an epicenter within China, and virologists and physicians were beginning to notice things were awry. They didn't really have a mechanism for telling the world and getting this information out without before having to go through their hierarchy. And when you tie some public health issues to things like optics, power, or the sense of maybe national security, things maybe don't get out as quickly. And if you could authenticate and have a handshake for these different nodes, you could bring this information into a system much more rapidly so that it could be integrated and acted upon by public health systems globally. So those are sort of the principles that we're working with in this system.
Excellent. And that's a very grand vision that actually spans multiple countries, sort of as Tomas said. You may be able to do everything right within your own nation, as Sonia has, for example, but then you have this challenge of what do you do with other nations and other industries from outside of that, which is a good segue to Idris, which sort of said how Switzerland already has a whole of society approach to building trust. What are your thoughts about where should Switzerland go, both in the medical trust side and supply chain sides, but are there other things that Switzerland could do to sort of really, I mean, it already is a leader, but sort of take it to another level of leadership in this space?
Yes, so I guess I said that people trust the system. For the technology behind it, I guess they may over trust us. Let me explain, or let me be clear. So Geneva University Hospital has been really leader in EMR, electronic medical records. Obviously, nothing compared to Estonia, which is very impressive. But in Geneva, we have a strong expertise in doing that. Yet, people still trust that the data are at a really high level of security. Obviously, we do our best, the system do the best, but imagine a very aggressive attack and we won't be able to resist, probably. And our patients, I'm not sure they are fully aware of this situation. So you trust the system, but still you use to have trusted tools. I don't think that our patients are really interested in the how we do it. And if I have some time, I will show you the experience with the study we are running on seroprevalence of SARS-CoV-2 antibodies.
Right.
That we just published 1 week ago in the Lancet, which used to be a really highly recommended journal, by the way. But basically, what I was saying is the why. So more than the how it's done, patient and I guess consumer just to want to understand the why. And mostly for the patient, if it's for helping them in the treatment, in better care, and they are happy actually not to give the data, but to share the data. So they have there's a winning process for themselves. And at the hospital, they are really willing, most of them, to share the data. I would also say that actually the majority of the patients expect us to make use of the data. Often they are really surprised when we ask them, do you agree that we use your data for science? Usually they go to the Geneva University Hospital for this reason precisely. So there is a misconception, sometimes over trusting the tools while trusting the system. And I guess the trust is really balanced by the needs of the people. If it's kind of help me, I'm happy to share and trust. If not, then the trust is really more complicated to have. The example of the seroprevalence study was just that we are running a massive study, and actually a lot of people were willing to participate to the science. But when they realized that we will wait for several weeks before returning the results,
right,
then you could see that the motivation decreased a little bit. So they need to be a win-win solution when you share the data.
Very well said. And so I think what you're saying is that, yeah, people need to see what the benefit is. They need to see either the benefit for themselves or their larger community. And if it's too prolonged to see the benefit, they might lose interest. So that's a very interesting insight to the economy of trust.
Right.
Tomas, I'm going to circle to you real quick before we go to the lightning round, because we have a question that came in related to what you said. You talked about, there's going to be a need to go beyond individual nations and try to figure out how do we, at least maybe it's something that Europe and the United States and Canada works on, but how we are going to have trust in supply chains beyond borders. And the question was, is in your experience, would you recommend this is something where governments come together to make this happen? Or is this something where maybe large industry players come together first to make it happen? So it was a question about what would you think about how that would get started? And I think you're gonna have to unmute yourself too.
Well, I think government will be involved one way or another in any case, because you will have certification. I mean, okay, maybe not for surgical masks, but on anything more complex, you're going to have whatever agency it is that certifies equipment or drugs. So it'll be there. The question is, I mean, who should take the lead? I mean, whoever, where the need is, should take the lead. I mean, I think that the European Union certainly, as already a very international body with 27 members, should be working on this, and certainly it should be part of the transatlantic relationship. And I think also that, I mean, everyone else who can can provide, at least can prove that they're serious and honest, should be involved. Because national authorities will be the ones making the approvals or the certifications, but that does in no way excludes the idea that private companies should start doing this. And certainly, again, I think since I think that blockchain or permission blockchain and or keyless signature approach to this is really is absolutely necessary to guarantee integrity of the chain, supply chain, that they will be involved. I mean, that's just, I mean, that's how you guarantee it. So I think what you need is actually an effort from both sides. I mean, I think you need, you're not going to bypass the governments, but on the other hand, governments are notoriously slow in getting things done. So if the effort comes from the private sector to start something, then they can work out the details with the certifying authorities as well.
Excellent, and thank you. And that's a good segue now to the lightning round. We have about 7 minutes left for folks. The question that I'm going to ask each of you is sort of, given that we've talked about this idea of how an economy of trust is important for medicine, for supply chains, and we've had a question even asked about, well, how do we get started? And I appreciate Tomas's response. What would each of you give as tweet length answers, 1 or 2 tweet length answers as to the steps, whether it's from the public sector or private sector, to get started? Peter, I'm going to go first to you, and then Danielle. What would you recommend if we wanted to recognize that COVID-19 has changed the world and we were already changing? What would be the next positive steps, 1 or 2 steps that you'd recommend as tweet length answers?
Well, since I'm sitting in Washington, let me pretend I'm recommending what this or the next U.S. administration would do. In that case, I would say go all in on trade and investment relationships, particularly with like-minded countries where there is already a big trust factor, to get at, among other things, some of the things that Tomas said.
Excellent. That was a great succinct answer, and hopefully some folks will hear that. So thank you for that, Peter. Danielle, your thoughts. What would be 1 or 2 tweet length answers that you would recommend?
Yes, so much to what Peter just said. Real-time efficacy and data sharing and interoperability via systems designed by security.
Very well done. And I think that does point to the heart of what we currently do not have in the United States. I know we pointed out how Estonia has shown the model, so it is possible. But if we don't have that in the United States, we're not going to be able to make this move forward. All right, next, Tomas, I know you had already given a response, but if you could give 1 or 2 tweets as to what you think folks could do to move this forward, what would be your thoughts in this space? And I think, unfortunately, you got to unmute yourself again. Sorry.
Offer your citizens secure identities with which to access information. That would be one. The second is, at least at the European Union level, you can in fact make all healthcare records interoperable, so that I can, if I'm an Estonian who goes to Greece and gets sick, the doctor can look at my medical records in Greek. That's not difficult. Same thing with prescriptions, which we implemented with Finland already, that you go to you can get your medicines in Estonia if you're a Finn, because it's all digitized. And then on the, I think that we really do need a task force on integrity of supply chains that would be multinational, that needs to be also public and private.
Well said, and I liked how you emphasized the identity layer. That's something that again we are lacking in the United States, and we could easily have another hour-long conversation. Another senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, Lord Tim Clement Jones in the UK, pointed out how the UK government spent more than £200 million trying to have it be government-led, only to have to say we now need to pivot to industry. So there are better ways we can be responsible.
I know about that program, and that was a disaster, and they should have done it right.
Yes, exactly. And so I think leveraging the lessons that you have, Tomas, and the lessons that everyone's shared here, we can help other nations avoid expending the amount of money that has been already spent in this space. So well said. Thank you, Tomas. And now I'd like to turn to Divya. What are your 1 or 2 tweets that you recommend that we take as actions forward?
I have a few more than 1 or 2, but I'll be really quick.
Okay, as long as you're really quick, it's all good.
The very first one is, please do not tie life-saving components of your supply chain exclusively to a profit motive. That's a recipe for disaster. The second is to not completely outsource all supply chains. In the times of needs or crisis, you should be able to quickly dial up the things that are life-saving and build resilience through diversification. And also through leveraging technologies we didn't talk about too much today, but things like artificial intelligence to help us look what we have and to repurpose things that are life-saving. Finally, I really believe that we need to start stockpiling components in many local areas that are fungible or can be used to ramp up just-in-time resources, things like CRISPR cartridges for biosensing novel viruses and our manufacturing capabilities.
Excellent. And that's a great point, that we need to recognize decentralization in the real world, just as it's a solution in the data world.
Yeah.
May be a good way forward.
That's
Idris, you go next, and then we'll go to Philippe for the final close. So Idris, what would be your recommendations?
Yeah, maybe one tweet I would suggest to be globally trustable, to be trusted on specifics.
Excellent. Very well said. Globally, yeah. Think globally, but also make sure you get the specifics right, else it'll all fall apart. So thank you. Very well said. And Philippe, you get to close with, what are your thoughts going forward, and what should we do?
Okay, so for me, it could be something around trust is mandatory for our future, and that the economy of trust is perhaps our new paradigm, and let's work on concrete solutions now. That's the first one. The second one on data, because what we've discussed today is trust by design for data, but I would add a new word on that, is consent. And I think having trust and consent for the data or sharing the data is something very important for the future.
Very well said, that we need to recognize in open societies, we still need to give people choice and agency, and consent is a core part of that. Thank you, Philippe. Thank you to all our panelists today. This has been a great discussion. Thank you for all that you do as positive change agents. And I look forward to continuing the conversation about making more resilient supply chains going forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.